What is narrative situation? Three separate components form the narrative situation: the author, the narrator, and the reader. Each role is dependent on the other in a cycle. The process in which the narrative situation is formed is similar to the filmmaking process, with the screenwriter, storyteller, and an audience. The author is like the screenwriter. He creates the narrator and the fabula to serve a purpose. The fabula is a fictional world that the author creates. It includes a location, event, or events, and characters. The purpose conveyed through the fabula can be based on moral, intellectual, aesthetic, or political concerns. The narrator is like the storyteller. He tells the story to the reader. And finally, the reader is like the audience. He tries to determine the author's purpose for creating the work of literature. The narrative situation is important to understand because it is the basis in which one interprets a work of literature. The narrative situation is an important component of HL English for the internal and external assessments, as well as Paper 1 and Paper 2 exams. You will need to determine the narrative situation when analyzing poems, novels, and dramas. A deeper understanding of the author's, narrator's, and reader's experiences of the fabula are also important components of the narrative situation that you will need to know for HL English. The author creates an incomplete world, which can be defined as the fabula. What is included in the fabula is selected from the larger global society by the author, which means all aspects of the world are not represented, thus resulting in a finite number of events, locations, and actions. The author chooses how to tell the story, but the collection of related events are put in order by the narrator. Since the author creates the fabula, he knows all. The narrator lives in the world that the author creates, and his experience is a reflection of his world. In the fabula, there is an infinite number of activities, locations, and events that the narrator experiences. The events of the fabula happen in a specific order that flow together smoothly. The narrator only knows what's going on in his point of view. The reader interprets the events in the fabula. When a reader interprets literature, part of his interpretation is based on his experiences, which are fragments and/or reflections of the reader's world. To the reader, the fabula consists of a collection of related events until he makes a connection to the narrator's perspective. The narrator's perspective is the narrator's relation to the events in the fabula. The reader only knows information explained by the narrator and only knows the order of events as told by the narrator. Based on the author's, narrator's, and reader's experiences of the fabula, we can determine that the cycle consists of the author speaking to the narrator, who then speaks to the reader. The narrative transaction is the relationship among the author, narrator, and reader. It is split into 6 components: the real author, implied author, narrator, narratee, implied reader, and real reader. The real author writes the work of literature. The implied author is the author's purpose as determined by the reader. The author creates the narrator, who talks to the narratee. The narratee has a presence in the fabula. The implied reader is the reader the author wrote the work of literature for. The real reader wants to become the implied reader by interpreting the author's and narrator's purpose. Another aspect of the narrative situation is the narrative distance. The narrative distance is a scale to determine what kind of narrator is present in the fabula. It consists of 2 extremes, the mind reader and the camera viewer. A narrator that comments on the spoken and unspoken thoughts and emotions of the characters in a fabula is like a mind reader. Some narrators may reflect on their earlier selves to be able to understand their previous thoughts and emotions, similar to a third-person narrator. This type of narration is known as a retrospective narration. A mind reader narrator may even change his perspective to third person in order to separate himself from time and his earlier self. Though it may seem like a first-person narrator is like a mind reader, he is not. In fact, a first-person narrator may be unaware of his own thoughts, emotions, and motivations. The narrator who only discusses what he views, on the other hand, is a camera viewer. Now, let's put all this knowledge to work. We will determine the narrative situation in the poem One Art by Elizabeth Bishop. In this example, the screenwriter is Elizabeth Bishop. Bishop wrote the poem One Art and specifically included events in the fabula from the real world. A reader can easily determine the real author of the poem by simply looking at who the poem was written by. Determining the implied author, narrator, and narratee of the poem, however, is more difficult. Elements of the poem like sentence structure, punctuation, verb tense, and the perspective in which the poem is told all help determine the narrator, narratee, and implied author. The reader establishes the implied author by determining the author's purpose. In One Art, the author's purpose for writing a text is to show that an individual cannot use art to lie. The narrator, like the storyteller in this poem, is speaking in first person. Characteristics of the narrator can be determined by the tone and structure of the poem. The narrator in One Art follows a specific villanelle structure to convince herself that losing the narratee was not a disaster. The narrator references the narratee in line 16 when the narrator states, "Even losing you." The narrator's use of "you" in this line suggests that the narrator was speaking to her past lover. Through the narrator's inability to follow the rigid villanelle structure, we see the irrational nature of the narrator. The reader, like the audience, determines the narrator's position on the narrative distance scale. The narrator is between the camera view and a mind reader because she is only aware of her thoughts. Based on the fabula, we can interpret that the narrator is trying to convince herself of the lies she is telling. The art of losing isn't hard to master. In line 19, the narrator states, "Write it," suggesting that the narrator realizes she is lying and forces herself to continue. The reader of One Art becomes the implied reader by interpreting the poem to determine the author's and narrator's purpose. In the poem One Art, the author's purpose is to show how an individual cannot use art to lie, whereas the narrator's purpose is to convince herself that losing the narratee was not a disaster. So, in recap, the narrative situation is: the real author of the work of literature is like the screenwriter. It is up to the reader to figure out the implied author by determining the author's purpose. The author creates the fabula. The author uses various literary devices to give insight on the nature of the narrator. Depending on the text, there may or may not be a narratee. The narratee is the character that the narrator refers to in the fabula. Any reader who interprets the work of literature is known as a real reader. The implied reader is who the author wrote the text for and is who the real reader wants to become. In order to become the implied reader, the reader needs to have the experiences and knowledge that allows them to understand what the author intended for the work of literature. Thank you.